Senator Ludlam.
Thanks, Mr Acting Deputy President. It gives me, as a number of my colleagues have remarked, no pleasure whatsoever to rise and speak in opposition to this bill. And I want to just briefly reflect, as many of us have, on the circumstances that brought us here. In 2010, new Prime Minister Gillard delivered a speech on the question of boat arrivals and expressed the need to protect our way of life, and that thereby buying into this entirely disingenuous conflation of two completely distinct issues, that of asylum seekers, refugees, people fleeing war, violence, ethnic cleansing in our region or in other parts of the world, and border protection, as though these were somehow the same issue. The conflation of those two issues was very effectively developed and deployed by former Prime Minister John Howard, former Immigration Minister Philip Ruddock. It's been extraordinary listening to contributions from the other side over the last 24 hours, celebrating the fact that we're back, that we were right, and that we're here again. The Prime Minister, Gillard in this case, went on to say, "I understand the anxiety in the community around boat arrivals. And it's on this foundation, the notion that refugees are a threat to our way of life, and that the anxiety around them is therefore justified, should even be talked up, encouraged." All subsequent Labor and Coalition discussion on this policy has rested. The ALP has completely accepted the toxic and inaccurate premise of the debate set by the Coalition, and the premise goes virtually unchallenged within the public pronouncements of the major parties, and it's been left to the Greens to make what seems to us so obvious, to put that case into the public record. The ethical thing for the new Prime Minister to have done would have been to show leadership on the issue, and actually I think that's what former Prime Minister Rudd and his front bench had attempted to do in the moves that they made when they came to power, to formally and legislatively reject the Pacific solution that was in place. Prime Minister Gillard could have continued down that course, and she didn't. By validating people's fear of this, as some Coalition MPs have spoken, this tsunami of illegal arrivals, this flood of people, queue jumpers, we heard the phrase again, the speaker just before me. By validating that fear, Labor has, I think, fallen into the trap predicated on an assumption that not only does the Australian public not know any better, but also that we can't know any better. It preaches to a base, and I think completely wrong, understanding of Australian culture and of the Australian tradition of the fair go. I think it sells us all short.
Fair go is giving everyone their chance.
I'm going to ignore you, Senator McDonald, lest I say something that I will regret.
Order. Senators on my left are reminded that senators have the right to be heard in silence.
So the proclamations and the policies from the ALP and the Coalition suggest that they believe a solution is something that frightens asylum seekers away from Australia. We've heard a great deal from both sides of the chamber on that premise in the last few days. The problem being that people flee their homelands, that the processes for application abroad are painfully and dangerously slow, if they exist at all, that other countries are ruthlessly cruel to refugees, and that the heads of the smuggler rings take advantage of a ready supply of desperate people to fleece them of their savings and offer them a cramped spot on a voyage that might kill them. Until the major parties publicly accept this entire picture and not just one convenient element of it, there won't be any solution. So we've always opposed Labor's Malaysia solution because it's a people-dumping proposal. Put quite simply, it's a live people trade of 800 asylum seekers who are to be made an example of, to rot behind barbed wire effectively forever, as an example to other people who might be seeking to make the voyage, for 4,000 people in exchange who had already been accepted as refugees, living freely but not particularly welcome in Malaysia. And in August 2001, as senators know, that scheme, that disastrous people-dumping scheme, was rejected by the High Court in a case brought by David Mann of the Refugee and Immigration Law Centre. Mann is the grandson of refugees who fled the Nazis, with the help of people smugglers, I might add. And to him, the notion that people could reach Australian waters to claim asylum and then be sent to a third country in which their human rights are, on the balance of evidence, in very serious danger, was morally and legally repulsive, and fortunately the High Court agreed. The decision not only rendered the Malaysian people dumping project illegal, it also cast doubt on the legality of all offshore processing, including on Nauru. The Greens, for that reason, opposed Mr Oakeshott's bill, which has effectively just stripped out what little protections exist at current law, and we therefore, of course, oppose this bill. To support either would have marked a 180-degree turn on very long-held principles and policies, and it would have been an offence to reason and decency and a betrayal not only of the people who are seeking refuge here in Australia, but a betrayal also of the many Australians who trusted us with their votes, knowing where we stand. A real regional solution would involve supporting human rights abroad, not only in the countries from which people originally flee, some of which we recently invaded, but also those through which they pass on their way to Australia. And that means overhauling Australia's overseas asylum application system so that it is no longer so prohibitively slow, and significantly increasing Australia's humanitarian intake. And some of these recommendations, of course, were taken up by the recent expert panel. And some of these recommendations, we hope, won't be lost in the appalling furor that has erupted in this chamber, in this parliament over the last few days. The UNHCR's annual budget in Indonesia is around $6 million. If the government and the opposition are serious about saving lives, why not support the UNHCR in providing a safe pathway to asylum for genuine refugees? And of course, most of the people who do find their way here, as everybody knows, and I think most senators on both sides acknowledge, are genuine refugees, are people seeking the kind of violence that we would not subject ourselves and our families to were it occurring here. And the word queue is thrown around to depict boat arrivals as sneaky and unjust or even unchristian, one of the strangest contributions to the debate that I've heard so far. So in Indonesia, the wait in the queue to be resettled from refugee camps is 76 years. An immediate increase in UNHCR funding of at least $10 million from Australia will at least increase their capacity to assess asylum applications. This, of course, was rejected by the major parties. So early last year, a Hazara refugee in Leonora detention centre told a journalist this. He said, "The people of Australia must understand we are not criminals, we are homeless. If peace in Afghanistan comes back, we won't stay in Australia because we love our country and we all want to help our nation. If Afghanistan has peace, nobody comes across a big ocean with 99% chance of death for a 1% chance in a small boat to come here. Many Afghans died in Malaysia to Indonesia trip. All Afghan people take risk and our life risk because they want to work here for peace. Their life is in danger. Because of this, they cross the ocean to reach here and want protection in Australia." And that, I think, is something that has been so completely lost in this debate. How dangerous and how serious does your deterrent have to be? And I realise now, addressing the majority of this chamber, if you want to break the business model, so-called, of the people smugglers, you need to be scarier than drowning, you need to be scarier than war, ethnic cleansing, torture. You need to be more of a deterrent than the things that these people are justifiably fleeing from. And we all know that that simply won't happen. These processes that are combined with the oppressive and dangerous conditions in Sri Lanka, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq and other states from which people who arrive here seeking refuge, they provide the customers for this so-called business model of the people smugglers. And instead of making the alternative more accessible so that people don't climb onto these vessels in the first place, the major party's approach is to make the smuggler's path undesirable by making the destination scarier than war and ethnic cleansing and torture and systematic rape and violence that these people are fleeing. The major parties believe a successful policy is one that makes refugees believe that they are better off facing repression in Iran, violence in Afghanistan or persecution in Malaysia than they are by reaching Australia's waters by boat. We have reached a point that this is how Labor and the Coalition define success, and history, I believe, will see it differently.